In the biting breath of a Bangor winter night, snow fell like silent ash across an empty roadside. Beneath a broken street lamp, a young widow knelt in the drifts, her arms wrapped around a little girl in a torn red coat. The child's bare feet were blue from the cold, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Two German shepherds stood guard, their warm breath rising in clouds, while a battle-worn carpenter, once a soldier, hurried toward them. The little girl's lips trembled as she leaned close to her unconscious mother and whispered, "Mommy, please don't die." Neither the man nor the dogs knew it yet, but the fight ahead would not be against the storm. It would be against a world that had already turned its back. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Subscribe for more stories that stay with your heart. Now, let's begin. Early winter. Snow swept sideways across the two-lane road beyond the last streetlight, the sky a low gray lid pressing down on the black line of pines. The wind carried a knife's patience, shaving the color from everything until only white and shadow remained. On the shoulder, where the plows had thrown up a ridge of frozen, dirty snow, a woman knelt and would not rise. Her name was Lydia Harper, 32, a widow only a week, and grief had carved new lines into her face. She was medium height, narrow-shouldered, her frame made thinner by too many skipped meals. The wind had burned her cheeks raw, her mouth pressed tight, holding in the tremor she could not let her daughter see. Her brown hair, usually tied neatly for housework, hung loose tonight, tangled, stiffened by ice, and stuck to her temples. Her skin was pale, faintly freckled, a reminder of summers that felt like another life. Dirt still clung under her nails from hurried packing, as if speed could outrun cruelty. In her arms was Mia, her 5-year-old daughter, light as kindling. Mia wore a torn red cardigan that had once been bright, now faded, the hem unraveling and mismatched buttons barely holding it closed. The sleeves ended above her thin wrists. Her hair, the color of late wheat, was plastered to her forehead with melt. Her face was streaked with frozen tear tracks. One bare foot hung limply, toes bluish, nails untrimmed. At her hairline, a thin smear of blood had frozen into the strands. No headlights broke the darkness. No voices carried on the wind, only Lydia's shallow breath and the crunch of ice shifting beneath her knees. Then, from the tree line, came the sharp crack of barks. Two shapes bounded into the halo of a broken street lamp. Duke, a German shepherd of 8 years, black and tan with a deep saddle marking and a thin scar curving along his muzzle, moved with a steady, deliberate gait. His dark eyes swept over the scene, alert and calculating. Beside him, Rex, 6 years old, golden tan with a dark saddle, younger and broader in the chest, pushed forward with restless energy, his ears pricked, tail stiff, breath fogging in the frigid air. They stopped just a few feet away, barking with a mix of warning and urgency, their breath puffing in clouds. From behind them, a man emerged into the light. Ethan Cole, 45, tall but lean from years of physical work, carried himself with a soldier's economy of movement. His face was angular, jawline rough under a short beard threaded with gray. His hair, once dark, was peppered with silver and cut short against the cold. His pale blue eyes held both focus and a deep weariness, shadows left by nights that never truly ended. He wore a heavy canvas jacket, frayed at the cuffs, over a red flannel shirt and faded jeans. His gloved hands hung open at his sides, palms forward, as though approaching something wild. Ethan had once been a soldier. Now he was a carpenter, earning just enough from repair jobs to keep a small cabin on the edge of town. The war had taken his sleep and left him with a limp on bad days, but it hadn't taken his instinct to move toward trouble instead of away from it. The dogs looked back at him, barking again. Short, urgent bursts that cut through the wind. Ethan's gaze fell on the woman and the small bundle in her arms. His steps quickened, boots crunching through the snow, breath clouding in front of him. He didn't speak yet. The dogs fanned out, one circling to the side, the other keeping ahead, as if to guard against whatever had left the two figures stranded here. Snow hissed against the road. The cold seemed to press closer. Ethan's shadow stretched toward them, long and dark under the broken street lamp. Whether he would reach them in time, whether they could survive this night, remained unknown. Ethan Cole didn't hesitate. The girl's weight was shockingly light in his arms, and he could feel the rigid chill in her small frame even through her torn red cardigan. With his other arm, he steadied Lydia Harper, whose legs moved stiffly as if each step demanded more strength than she had left. The snow bit at their faces as he guided her toward the battered blue Ford pickup waiting under the broken street lamp. He opened the back door and laid Mia gently across the bench seat, tucking a folded wool blanket around her. Lydia climbed in beside her daughter, clutching the blanket closed as though afraid it might be stolen. Ethan shut the door carefully, then rounded to the driver's side. Duke and Rex leapt into the bed of the truck without command, their claws clicking against the metal before settling. Tails low, heads turned to watch the road ahead. The heater groaned as Ethan turned the key. The truck lurched forward, tires crunching through ice. The road to his cabin wound along the frozen river, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the swirling snow. He glanced in the mirror, catching Lydia's eyes for a moment. Wide, tired, and still guarded. Her hands were pressed to Mia's cheeks, as if by sheer will she could warm her child. Ethan's cabin sat at the edge of a pine grove 2 miles out of town. It was a modest one-story structure, the kind a man could build and repair alone, rough-cut timber walls, a corrugated tin roof patched in more than one place. The front steps sagged, and the porch light was a single bare bulb that glowed weakly in the storm. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove embraced them. The air smelled faintly of pine resin and sawdust. The walls were lined with Ethan's work. Solid shelves, a handmade table, chairs with worn seats. A faded photograph of a younger Ethan in uniform hung beside the door, its edges curling. He led Lydia to the small living room, where the stove glowed in its iron belly. Duke padded in first, curling up near the hearth. Rex lay close beside Mia, his head resting on the rug, as if claiming his post as guardian. Ethan returned from the kitchen with a chipped ceramic mug of hot water, steam curling from the rim, and set it on the table. "I'll make some broth," he said. His voice was even, carrying no demand, only statement. In the narrow kitchen, he lit a small propane burner and set a dented pot over the flame. He poured in chicken stock from a jar, added thin slices of potato and a handful of carrots. The aroma filled the cabin, mingling with the wood smoke. Lydia sat silently, her back straight despite her exhaustion, watching every movement he made. Ethan noticed. "You're safe here," he said without turning, stirring the pot slowly. Her eyes softened, but she didn't answer. When the soup was ready, he ladled it into a bowl and set it on the table with a spoon. Lydia's hands shook as she lifted the spoon to her lips, the warmth making her eyes sting. She ate slowly, as if unfamiliar with the feeling of food that wasn't rushed or stolen between chores. Ethan crouched beside Mia, checking her forehead. Her skin was clammy, but not as cold as before. He pulled a clean cloth from a drawer, dipped it into the mug of hot water, and pressed it gently to the girl's brow. The movement was practiced, almost tender, though his face stayed composed. From outside, the wind whistled through the eaves. Snow rattled against the window glass. After a while, Lydia spoke for the first time since entering the cabin. "Why did you stop?" Her voice was quiet, roughened by cold. Ethan looked up from where he was kneeling. "Because no one else would." His gaze was steady, and for a heartbeat she saw the shadow of someone who had once made a habit of stepping into danger. A soft knock at the door startled them both. Duke was on his feet in an instant, his ears pricked. Ethan crossed to the door and opened it to reveal Mrs. Agnes Turner, a woman in her late 60s who lived a half-mile down the road. She was small and round-shouldered, her frame wrapped in a thick brown coat with a fur-lined hood. Wisps of white hair peeked out from under a knitted cap. Her face was pink from the wind, but her eyes, gray and shrewd, missed nothing. Agnes had been a nurse in Bangor for 30 years before retiring, and her reputation was of someone who spoke plainly and never wasted time. "I saw your truck pull in," she said, brushing snow from her boots before stepping inside. "The storm's only getting worse. Who've you brought home?" Ethan stepped aside, and her gaze fell on Lydia and Mia. Without asking, she removed her gloves and came forward, her movements brisk but gentle. She laid a hand on Mia's forehead, pressing her lips together in concentration. "She's feverish, but it's not too far gone," Agnes said, looking at Lydia now. "Keep her warm, keep fluids in her. I'll bring some medicine in the morning if the road clears." Lydia murmured a thank you. Agnes only nodded and gave Ethan a look that spoke volumes. About responsibility, about strangers in need, before heading back into the storm. When the door closed, the cabin felt smaller but warmer somehow. Ethan refilled Lydia's bowl without asking, and she accepted this time without hesitation. Rex shifted closer to the hearth, resting his head on Mia's feet, while Duke kept watch on the door, his amber eyes unblinking. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his own soup untouched. For a long while, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady breathing of the girl on the couch. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the air held a fragile stillness, as if this small shelter might keep the world's cruelties at bay, at least for one night. And for now, that was enough. The morning after the storm broke over Bangor, the light was sharp and pale, bouncing off the snowdrifts piled high against the cabin walls. The air carried that deep winter stillness where even sound seemed frozen. Ethan Cole stood in the yard, boots half buried in snow, splitting logs with slow, precise swings of his axe. Each strike landed with a clean crack, sending the scent of fresh pine into the brittle air. His breath rose in pale clouds, and a faint ache had settled in his shoulders, an old reminder that his body had weathered more than its share of winters. Inside, Lydia Harper stirred awake on the couch, blinking against the gray light seeping through the curtains. The first thing she saw was Duke, the older German shepherd, lying near Mia's side with his head resting on his front paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. His scarred muzzle twitched every so often, ears tilting toward every sound. Rex, the younger of the pair, sat closer to the hearth, his golden tan coat glistening in the firelight, occasionally shifting to glance at the girl, as if checking for any sign of movement. Lydia sat up slowly, adjusting the blanket around herself. Mia was still sleeping, her cheeks flushed, breath warm but shallow. Lydia reached to smooth a strand of hair from her daughter's face, her fingers trembling slightly. It had been a long time since she'd been in a space where someone, or something, kept watch over them through the night. The cabin door opened with a blast of cold air. Ethan stepped inside, brushing snow from his jacket. He carried a small paper bag under one arm, his other hand gripping a thermos that steamed faintly. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold, and his pale blue eyes softened as they landed on Mia. "Got these from Paul's store before the roads iced over," he said, holding up the bag. "Fever reducer, electrolyte packets, and coffee, if you're up for it." He set the thermos on the table and crouched beside Mia, feeling her forehead with the back of his hand. "She's a little warm, but that's better than last night." Lydia nodded but said nothing. She watched as he carefully unwrapped a dose of medicine, mixing it with warm water before coaxing Mia to sip in her half-sleep. When he finally sat down across from her, Ethan poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "I guess you're wondering why a man ends up alone out here, just him and 2 dogs," he said. His voice carried no self-pity, just the flat steadiness of someone who'd repeated the story to himself enough times to dull its edges. "I chose carpentry because it's quiet. You measure, you cut, you build. No politics, no noise. Just the work and your hands." His gaze drifted to the wall where an unfinished shelf leaned against the corner. "After I got back, I tried the city for a while. Too many people, too many triggers. Out here, it's easier to breathe." Lydia's eyes traced the lines in his face, the faint crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw tightened at certain words. She didn't respond right away, then said quietly, "My husband wasn't a soldier, but he knew how to fight. He fought me every day we were married, sometimes with words, sometimes with his hands. His family made sure I learned how small I could be. They called it discipline. I called it survival." The words hung in the air between them. Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, rattling the cabin shutters. By nightfall, the storm had returned in earnest. Snow hissed against the windows, and the air inside seemed to contract with the cold. Mia's fever spiked again, her small body tossing under the quilt. Lydia sat beside her, holding her daughter's hand as tears tracked silently down her face. She murmured fragments, half lullabies, half prayers, while wiping Mia's damp brow with a cloth. Ethan stood in the doorway, leaning his back against the frame. His hands were balled into fists at his sides, not from anger at her, but from the fight inside himself to keep old images at bay. Images of nights in another country, of sand and smoke, of carrying bodies smaller than they should have been. He exhaled slowly, forcing his grip to loosen. The wood in the stove shifted with a pop, sending sparks upward. Duke rose from his place and padded over to Ethan, pressing his head against the man's hip. Rex followed, leaning just close enough to Lydia that she felt his solid warmth. The cabin seemed to close in then, not in a way that trapped them, but in a way that made the world outside feel far away. The night was long, but none of them left their posts. By the third morning, the storm had eased into a dull, cold wind that rattled the bare branches along the road into Bangor. The sky hung heavy and pale, as though it had been rubbed with chalk. Ethan offered to drive Lydia into town for supplies, but she shook her head. "I need to go alone," she said quietly, wrapping her scarf twice around her neck. Her voice carried that edge of stubbornness that comes from years of needing to prove she could still stand on her own feet, even when they ached. The main street of Bangor was already awake when she arrived, the snow shoveled into high banks along the sidewalks. It was lined with red brick buildings whose windows fogged from the warmth inside. A row of battered pickup trucks and compact cars was parked along the curb, their hoods still steaming in the cold. As Lydia walked, she felt the weight of eyes turning her way. Sarah McKinney, a tall, narrow-faced woman in her early 50s with ash-blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, stood behind the counter at the pharmacy. Sarah had run the place for decades, her pressed sweaters and spotless apron giving her a tidy, almost sharp appearance. Known for her precision in filling prescriptions, she was also known for an equally precise tongue, one that rarely kept an opinion to itself. She glanced up when Lydia stepped inside, her pale green eyes skimming over Lydia like she was something left on the doorstep too long. "I need children's fever medicine," Lydia said, her voice steady, though her hands were cold inside her gloves. Sarah turned, walked to the shelf, and returned with a box, placing it on the counter without a word. But when Lydia reached for her wallet, Sarah simply pushed the medicine toward her and said, "We'll put it on Ethan Cole's tab," in a tone that carried more meaning than courtesy. Lydia's mouth went dry. She didn't argue, just took the box, murmured a thank you, and left. Outside, the air was colder, though it wasn't the weather. She caught snippets from the open door of Harper's Diner, where two men in heavy coats leaned over their coffee mugs. One was Caleb Shore, a stocky man with a trimmed salt and pepper beard, the kind who laughed loud when among friends, but whose smile could vanish in an instant. He had worked maintenance at the Langford estate years ago before moving to odd jobs around town. The other, Nancy Boyd, a short, round-faced woman in her late 40s with a thick maroon coat, was the diner's owner, and had the kind of voice that carried whether you wanted it to or not. "She's living out there with him already?" Nancy said, disbelief mingling with satisfaction. Caleb snorted. "Beatrice says she's after whatever land he's got left. Poor man's not thinking straight after what he's seen." Lydia kept walking, but the words clung like frost to glass. By the time she reached the small grocery store, the pattern repeated itself. Roger Ellis, the wiry, weather-worn man who ran the store, barely looked up from the counter. His brown eyes flickered once toward her and then away, his jaw working like he was grinding down whatever he might say. Lydia bought a loaf of bread, but he dropped the change on the counter without meeting her gaze. When she stepped outside again, the weak sunlight caught on the frost along the street, making it glitter deceptively. She adjusted the scarf at her throat, ignoring the tightness in her chest. The trip back to the cabin felt longer than the walk into town. As she reached the edge of the pine grove, Duke was waiting, his black and tan form standing just beyond the first tree line. He trotted forward, tail low, eyes scanning the road behind her before falling into step beside her. Rex appeared moments later from the other side, his golden coat catching what little light filtered through the clouds. The dogs kept close enough that she could feel the heat from their bodies through her coat. Inside the cabin, Mia was awake, sitting cross-legged on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders. She was coloring in a dog-eared notebook Ethan had found in the shed. Her cheeks still held the flush of recovery, and she looked up with a smile that lit her pale blue eyes. Eyes so much like Lydia's late husband's that it made her heart twist. Lydia set the bag of groceries on the table and smoothed her daughter's hair. "Everything's fine," she said, with a smile she didn't feel. But Duke didn't leave her side, following her from table to stove, ears twitching at every small sound. Rex stretched out in the doorway, chin on his paws, his gaze fixed on the frost-laced window, as though he expected trouble to knock. Ethan returned not long after, snow dusting his shoulders from hauling wood. He studied her face for a moment, then glanced at the dogs. They don't shadow anyone like that unless they think something's wrong, he said. Lydia busied herself with unpacking the bread and medicine. It's nothing, she replied, too quickly. Ethan didn't press, but the set of his jaw said he knew more than she told. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere far off, a crow called into the cold. For now, the whispers of Bangor remained beyond the cabin walls, but they were coming closer. The days after Lydia's uneasy trip into Bangor settled into a cold, brittle rhythm. The wind seemed to carry whispers even through the thick pines around Ethan's cabin. Lydia kept to the yard, splitting her time between tending to Mia and helping Ethan with small chores, stacking wood, brushing snow from the porch. Duke and Rex stayed close, never straying far from whichever one of them was outside. On a gray Thursday morning, a vehicle unfamiliar to the road pulled up near the cabin. It was a dark green Jeep with Massachusetts plates, its tires hissing over the packed snow, the engine cut, and a tall man stepped out, brushing flakes from the shoulders of a charcoal wool coat. Finn Carter looked like someone who had spent much of his life outdoors, but never in one place long enough to grow roots. 34 years old, lean but not gaunt, his frame carried the wiry strength of a distance runner. His hair was chestnut brown, a little long at the back, and his jawline was defined, shadowed by a few days' worth of stubble. His eyes, gray with flecks of green, were alert, the kind that moved from detail to detail without missing much. In one gloved hand he carried a battered leather satchel, the other held a small camera. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his posture guarded, one hand resting on the doorframe. "You're lost, or you're looking for something," he said flatly. "I'm looking for the truth," Finn replied, voice calm but carrying an edge of conviction. "Name's Finn Carter, investigative reporter out of Boston. I'm following a thread about the Langford family's property dealings. Your name came up, and so did hers." He nodded toward Lydia, who had appeared in the doorway behind Ethan. Lydia's hands tightened on the edge of her sweater. Why would a reporter from Boston care about Bangor gossip? "Because," Finn said, stepping onto the porch but keeping a respectful distance, "some gossip turns out to be deliberate cover for something bigger. And I've seen the Langfords' name in more than one questionable land deal stretching back 15 years. They invited him in, the warmth of the cabin closing around the three of them. Finn set his satchel on the table, pulling out a thick folder of printed deeds, photocopies of old maps, and photographs of property lines marked in red ink. As he laid them out, he explained how the Langford family had quietly acquired parcels of land from smaller owners, often elderly or financially strained, through a mix of legal pressure and, in some cases, outright falsified records. 2 years ago, Finn said, tapping one map, this strip of woodland here, about 5 acres, was in your name, Ethan. While you were still deployed, the title was transferred to a Langford holding company. On paper, you sold it. No record of payment in your accounts. Sound familiar? Ethan's jaw worked, but he said nothing. He'd suspected something years ago, but he'd been too tired from fighting other battles to take it on. Finn's voice dropped slightly. You're not the only one. I've tracked at least 4 other cases like yours in Penobscot County alone. Lydia leaned forward, her eyes scanning the documents. One photograph showed Beatrice Langford at a courthouse function, Percy Hale a step behind her. They'll do the same to me, she murmured, only it won't be land they take. It'll be my daughter. Finn met her gaze. That's why I'm here. Beatrice has already started laying groundwork for a custody challenge. I've heard from a contact at the county office that she's pulling school district records, medical histories, anything she can twist. Ethan set his mug down hard enough that the coffee rippled. So what's your play? I document everything, Finn said simply. Paper trails, recorded statements, patterns of behavior, but I need your cooperation. No hiding, no half-truths. If this goes to court or the press, we'll need to be airtight. Lydia hesitated. She'd lived years keeping her head down, avoiding making herself a bigger target. But now, with Mia in the next room tracing her crayons across paper, the stakes felt sharper. I'll talk, she said finally, but I won't let this turn into a story that makes me look like a charity case. Finn gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm not in the business of pity. I'm in the business of proof. Over the next 2 hours, they went over what Lydia remembered. Dates, names, arguments with her late husband that might have left a paper trail. Ethan added his own recollections of the land he'd lost, The vague letters from the county he'd received while overseas, the lack of response when he'd written back. Duke wandered over during the conversation, resting his head on Lydia's knee as if sensing the tension. Rex lay near the door, eyes half open, ears flicking whenever the wind shifted. By the time Finn zipped his satchel closed, the light outside had dimmed into the pale blue of late afternoon. "I'll be around a few days," he said, pulling on his gloves. "Staying at the Pinecrest Motel. If you think of anything, call me." He slid a card across the table, sturdy cardstock, black lettering simple against the white. Finn Carter, investigative journalist. As his Jeep crunched down the snowy drive, Lydia stood at the window, the card still in her hand. "If he's right," she said quietly, "this won't stop until they get what they want." Ethan's gaze was fixed on the fading taillights. "Then we make sure what they want is out of reach." For the first time since the whispers began in Bangor, Lydia felt the faintest stirrings of something other than fear. Resolve. The following morning dawned in a sullen shade of gray, the kind of Bangor winter day where the clouds hung so low it felt like they might touch the roof of the cabin. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, and snow whispered down in lazy spirals. Lydia had just finished buttoning Mia's cardigan when the sound of tires crunching through the icy drive made both her and Ethan glance toward the window. Finn stepped out of his Jeep, the cold air painting his breath white. He was wrapped in a heavy navy peacoat, collar turned up against the wind, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His boots crunched on the frozen snow as he made his way to the porch. His expression was sharper than usual, the lines around his mouth drawn tight. Inside, Duke and Rex rose in unison. Duke, older, heavier, with the faint scar along his muzzle, stood in front of the door as though he could already sense that something heavy was coming. Rex, younger and lighter on his paws, paced behind him, tail low, but wagging slightly in recognition. When Ethan opened the door, Finn didn't waste time. "I've got something you need to hear," he said, voice low but urgent. He stepped inside, unbuckled his satchel, and pulled out a small digital recorder. The cold in his eyes was not from the weather. He set the device on the table, pressed play, and a faint crackle of static gave way to voices. It was Percy Hale's deep, slightly nasal tone. "We're not letting her get comfortable out there. The girl's ours to raise, not hers to ruin." Then Beatrice's clipped, cold voice followed. "We'll make sure she looks unfit, paint her as unstable, incapable. People will believe what they're told if you tell them enough times. Once Mia's with us, we'll deal with the rest. And Ethan Cole, he's just a distraction. We'll take back everything, land, influence, and the girl." The recording ended in silence, the kind that settles heavy on the chest. Lydia's knuckles whitened around the edge of the table. They were planning this the whole time. Her voice was barely a whisper. As if the universe wanted to underline the point, the knock came, a sharp rap at the door, quick and businesslike. On the porch stood a man in his late 40s wearing a county-issued winter coat, a flat wool cap pulled low over sandy hair gone silver at the temples. His cheeks were red from the cold, and in his gloved hand was a large envelope. "Lydia Harper?" he asked, his voice neutral, the voice of someone used to delivering messages that were not his own. "That's me," she said, stepping forward. Her voice trembled slightly, but her chin was up. The man handed over the envelope. "You've been served. Court date is set for 3 weeks from today. Custody hearing. Please confirm receipt." He produced a clipboard, had her sign, then nodded once and walked back toward a county SUV idling at the end of the drive. Lydia stood there a moment longer, the weight of the envelope like lead in her hands. She closed the door, leaned back against it, and exhaled shakily. "It's real now," she said. "They're actually taking me to court." Ethan took the envelope from her gently, set it on the table, and met her eyes. "Then we don't run, not anymore. They've been pushing you around for years, Lydia. Time to push back." Finn was already pulling out a yellow legal pad. "We'll need every scrap of evidence, dates, witnesses, records, even neighbors who can speak to your care for Mia. I've got the recording, but we'll need more. Beatrice plays long games. We have to be sharper." That night, the three of them gathered in the small living room, the wood stove throwing long, dancing shadows across the walls. Duke lay at Lydia's feet, his head heavy against her boots, eyes half-lidded but watchful. Rex sprawled closer to Mia, who was curled up in a quilt on the sofa, her small breaths deep and even. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but the glow from the stove kept the chill at bay. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the flames. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his voice carried weight. Tomorrow, we start building. Not just a case, but a wall they can't climb over. We'll win, not because it's easy, but because it's true. Lydia's eyes met his, and for the first time in weeks, there was no flinch, no guarded distance, just a flicker of trust. She placed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. "For Mia," she said softly. "For Mia," he echoed. Finn leaned back, watching them both. In all his years of chasing stories, he'd learned one thing. Sometimes the truth wasn't just about facts. It was about people who refused to let go of each other, no matter how much the world tried to pull them apart. Outside, snow kept falling, covering the driveway, the roof, the pines. By morning, it would look untouched, as if no one had come with threats and paper to shake the quiet of this place. But they all knew the peace was temporary. The real storm was just beginning. The courthouse in downtown Bangor stood like a block of stone against the pale winter sky, its steps glazed with a thin sheen of ice. Snow fell in lazy spirals, dusting the black coats of those hurrying inside. Lydia walked between Ethan and Finn, clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles blanched. Her dark hair was neatly pinned back, though a few loose strands clung to her pale cheeks in the cold. Her lips pressed into a thin line, not from fear alone, but from years of swallowing down words she'd never been allowed to say. Inside, the air was dry and faintly metallic, the scent of polished wood and old paper heavy in the courtroom. Beatrice Langford sat at the plaintiff's table, perfectly composed in a charcoal skirt suit, her blonde hair swept into a tight bun. Her icy blue eyes flicked to Lydia and then away, as though she'd just glanced at something beneath her. Beside her sat her attorney, Martin Keene, a lean man in his mid-50s with slicked-back gray hair and a permanent smirk that didn't reach his eyes. His tailored suit and gold cufflinks were a silent reminder of the family's money and reach. The judge, Harriet Calloway, entered, a woman in her early 60s, silver hair cropped short, her face lined not just with age, but with years of sifting lies from truth. She had the air of someone who would not be easily swayed by theatrics. The proceedings began quickly. Martin Keene rose, his voice smooth but carrying a blade beneath the velvet. "Your Honor, the child, Mia Harper, has been in the care of her mother in an environment that is, at best, unstable. My client wishes only to provide a safe, structured home, free from the unpredictable influence of a man suffering from war-related mental deterioration." His gaze slid to Ethan, deliberate and cutting. Lydia's stomach tightened, but she kept her eyes on Judge Calloway. When her turn came, Lydia stood, her hands steady on the folder. "Your Honor, since the night of the storm, I have done everything in my power to care for my daughter. This," she opened the folder, laying out Mia's medical records, photographs of her bundled warmly at Ethan's home, and a meticulous handwritten journal of daily meals, medicine, and bedtime routines, "is proof that she has been safe, fed, and loved." Martin made a small mocking sound, but Lydia ignored him. Finn was next to take the stand. In a clean navy blazer and wool scarf tucked neatly at his collar, he projected the quiet confidence of a man who made a living finding uncomfortable truths. "I am Finn Carter, investigative journalist out of Boston. Over the past 3 weeks, I've documented a series of interviews and obtained an audio recording in which Beatrice Langford and Percy Hale discuss orchestrating a false case against Mrs. Harper in order to obtain custody of her daughter. They also mention reclaiming land through coercive means, including property belonging to Mr. Ethan Cole." He held up a small recorder. "I have submitted the full recording to the court." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Ethan was called next. He walked to the stand with the measured steps of a man used to holding himself together under pressure. At 45, his broad shoulders and weathered face bore the marks of years in uniform, but his dark eyes carried something softer now: conviction. "That night," he began, voice low but steady, "I found Lydia and Mia on the side of Route 9 in the middle of the snowstorm. Mia was unconscious, Lydia barely standing. I didn't think about whether it was my place. I just acted. Since then, I've seen nothing but her fighting for that little girl, day and night. She's not unstable. She's unshakable. Judge Calloway listened without interrupting, her pen making slow, deliberate notes. Then Finn was recalled for redirect. He pulled another file from his satchel, this one containing land registry documents and signed statements from several Bangor residents. Your Honor, this is further evidence of fraudulent property claims tied to the Langford estate, implicating Percy Hale directly. Local law enforcement has been notified. Almost on cue, two uniformed officers entered quietly from the back of the room. They approached Percy, who had been sitting smugly behind Beatrice, and murmured something. Percy's ruddy face drained of color before he was escorted out in handcuffs. Beatrice's composure cracked, just for a flicker, her jaw tightening as she stared at the empty seat beside her. When all was said and done, Judge Calloway set down her pen. The evidence presented shows a clear attempt to mislead this court and manipulate custody proceedings. Mrs. Lydia Harper will retain full custody of her daughter, Mia Harper. Furthermore, the court acknowledges the role of Mr. Ethan Cole in providing stability and care during this period. His petition to be recognized as the child's legal stepfather is hereby granted. Lydia closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ethan reached for her hand under the table, giving it a quiet squeeze. In the back, Duke and Rex waited with a family friend who had brought them in from the truck. When the courtroom emptied into the snowy afternoon, both dogs bounded forward, tails high, as if they knew the verdict without being told. Mia laughed, a sound that hadn't been heard in far too long, and buried her face in Duke's fur. For the first time in months, the snow didn't feel like a wall between them and the world. It felt like a clean slate. Spring crept into Bangor like a shy guest, slow at first, then all at once. The last crusts of ice melted into the earth, revealing patches of tender green that pushed through the soil as if they had been waiting all winter for permission. The air carried the scent of damp pine and fresh grass, and for the first time in months, the wind felt like a friend rather than an enemy. In the small garden behind Ethan's cedar-sided house, a white canopy had been strung between two budding maple trees. Simple wooden chairs, built by Ethan himself, were arranged in two neat rows. The wedding was small by design, attended only by those who had stood beside Ethan and Lydia when the snow was at its cruelest. Finn Carter sat near the front, his navy suit a little rumpled, but his eyes bright. An elderly woman named Martha Jennings, the town's retired librarian, with kind hazel eyes and an endless supply of oatmeal cookies, sat with Mia in her lap until the music began. Lydia stood at the edge of the porch, her long, cream-colored dress brushing the soft earth. Her dark hair was loose today, falling in gentle waves over her shoulders, and the sunlight caught the faint freckles across her nose. Her cheeks held the warmth of someone who had weathered storms and still found the courage to smile. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, purple lupines, white daisies, and one stubborn yellow daffodil that Mia had insisted on adding. Ethan waited under the canopy. At 45, he was not the picture of a storybook groom, but something steadier, more real. His short graying hair was combed back, his beard trimmed, but still framing the strong lines of his jaw. He wore a simple dark suit and a handmade wooden buttoneer carved in the shape of a pine cone. His eyes, dark and deep, softened as he watched Lydia walk toward him, Mia trotting alongside in a pale blue dress that made her look like a piece of spring sky. Duke and Rex couldn't be convinced to sit still. They darted around the chairs, their black and brown and golden brown coats gleaming in the light, tails wagging furiously. At one point, Duke trotted up to Ethan with a stick in his mouth, as though to offer it as part of the ceremony. Laughter rippled through the small crowd. The vows were spoken quietly, without flourish. Ethan's voice caught when he promised to be not just a husband, but a father, and Lydia's eyes brimmed with tears as she promised to trust again. When they kissed, Mia clapped so hard her small hands turned pink, then spun in a quick circle and flung the bouquet into the air. Duke jumped for it, but missed by an inch, earning more laughter. As guests mingled, Beatrice Langford appeared at the edge of the garden. She wore a muted gray coat over a plain dress, her blonde hair pinned back simply, without the usual sharp precision. Her face looked different. Tired, but not guarded. Lydia noticed her immediately. For a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. "I came to say I'm sorry," Beatrice said, her voice low enough that only Lydia and Ethan could hear. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I was wrong. About you, about everything." Lydia's fingers tightened briefly on the folds of her dress. Then she gave a small nod. I'm letting it go. That's for me, not for you. Beatrice's eyes flickered with something like relief before she turned and walked away. A year passed, and the garden grew fuller. The little house became something more than a home. It became Haven Workshop. Ethan, with his calloused hands and patient voice, taught local teenagers the craft of woodworking. They came with shoulders hunched and eyes darting, but left with the pride of building something real from nothing. Lydia claimed a corner of the workshop for her reading nook, filling it with donated books, soft chairs, and a worn rug where children sprawled with storybooks in their laps. Mia thrived. She was taller now, her once thin frame filling out with the ease of a child who no longer worried about her next meal or whether the roof would hold through the night. She called Ethan Dad without hesitation, her laughter carrying through the open windows as she ran with Duke and Rex across the yard. On warm afternoons, the family would sit on the porch, Ethan with a mug of coffee, Lydia with a paperback, Mia sprawled on the steps sketching flowers. Duke and Rex would lie in the sun, eyes half closed but ears twitching at every sound. They seemed to know that their job hadn't ended. It had simply changed. Now, instead of guarding against the cold and the dark, they guarded the peace of this place. And in the soft gold of spring evenings, when the air smelled of sawdust and lilacs, it was clear to anyone passing by that this small patch of Bangor had become more than a home. It was a promise kept. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with trumpets or bright lights. They come quietly, in the form of a helping hand, a kind word, or a door that stays open when the world has turned cold. Ethan, Lydia, Mia, Duke, and Rex found each other in the storm. But perhaps it was never chance at all. Maybe it was God's gentle whisper, guiding their steps, reminding us that no one is too lost to be found, and no winter is too long for spring to come. In our own lives, we can be that miracle for someone, a neighbor, a stranger, even a friend we haven't met yet. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others can feel its warmth. Leave a comment with your thoughts or a prayer for those still searching for hope. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the light in the darkest places. May God bless you and keep you, today and always.